Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Good morning to those of you joining from the West Coast, and good evening to those of you in Europe. My name is Scott Cullinane, and I'm the Executive Director of U.S.-Europe Alliance. For those of you who don't know about us, we are a bipartisan initiative dedicated to mobilizing Americans to advocate for the enduring transatlantic partnership. Today, we are having the third event in our virtual Transatlantic Chats series. Now, these are concise conversations where we bring together voices from across America and across Europe to talk about the issues of the day. Before I go any further, let me pause for a brief second and to encourage everyone to please visit our website, useurope.org. And there you can sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, and that is absolutely the best way to stay in contact with us and to learn about upcoming events. Now for today, the topic is building a career in the transatlantic field. We wanted to host this event for several reasons, but let me just mention one here. You know, from here in DC, we love talking about policy, but policy is made by people. And to have good policy, we need to have a diverse and engaged network of people involved, especially with young professionals. So today, we're focusing on people and all the ways, big and small, to be involved. To help us discuss, this issue and building a career in this field, we have an absolutely fantastic panel of people. First off, we have Tim Rivera, who was formerly the program manager at the EU delegation in Washington. Before that, he worked for the British Council and is currently affiliated with the Transatlantic Policy Center at American University. All the way from North Carolina, we have Katie Shanahan-Lindner, who is the Executive Director of the Center for European Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. And to lead the discussion, we have my very good friend, Gene Schindler, who is a member of the U.S. Europe Advisory Council and who professionally works on international democracy and electoral assistance. And last point is we do want to incorporate questions from the audience. So for that, please do use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to include those in the conversation. And also, we are recording this event. And so if for any reason you don't want your picture recorded, please turn off your camera. And with that, it's all yours, Jean.
Thank you, Scott. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited about this conversation. I love talking about careers, partially because I feel like I still haven't figured out mine. So thank you for hosting this today. First off, to get us started, I want to launch a poll because I'm curious how many of you see yourselves ending up in Washington, how many of you want to permanently be in Europe, how many of you are in Europe. So if this works, I'm going to launch this and career poll in progress. So if you could click the button and tell me where you want to end up, that would be fantastic and helpful. And while you're doing that, I'm going to do a lightning round of questions with our two experts to get to know them a little bit better. So Tim, I'm going to go first with you. Your first country.
Sorry, pick a country.
The first European country you visited.
Ireland.
Favorite European country.
Oh, that's not fair. I might have to say Spain.
Choice. Beer garden or pub?
Beer garden.
Pantheon or Parthenon?
Oh gosh. Parthenon.
And would you chase a wheel of cheese down a hill, or have you?
Absolutely would. That sounds like fun.
Well, there's a festival every year in Gloucester where they do exactly that. So I think we need to put that on your to-do list.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, folks, oh good, looks like we're nearly done with the poll. So let's, really quick, Katie, first European country.
Germany.
Favorite European country?
Germany.
Orient Express or Trans-Siberian?
Ooh, Trans-Siberian.
Flamenco or polka?
Oh, flamenco.
And would you run from the bulls in Pamplona, or have you?
I have not. I'm a little frightened. I'd rather run after the cheese.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to end the polling. Looks like almost half of us want to end up in Washington. As a swamp creature myself, I say good choice. 23% US other. No one wants to end up in the UK. 9 people who want to be in Europe. And 1 person who made the excellent choice of going to Mars with Elon. We want to talk to you afterwards. So just to kick things off here, Tim, why don't you sort of start us off by talking about how we're defining transatlantic careers today? How are we thinking about this? What do we mean? What do we mean by transatlantic careers?
Sure. So I think there's a broad perception that you can only have a transatlantic career if you're working in an embassy or a consulate, or if you're working at a think tank or something like that. And I think has to be the first message, is that's absolutely not the case. Because transatlantic relations spans the whole agenda, it's not just foreign policy, security, and defense. Transatlantic relations extends through to climate change, energy, education, human rights, and so much more. So you can really make any career transatlantically oriented, because naturally there's going to be an opportunity to partner with transatlantic, with European institutions if you're in the US, or American institutions or if you're in Europe. There's always going to be something that you can learn or partner about with your counterparts across the Atlantic. So no matter where you are and where you end up in your career, you can actually turn it into a transatlantic career path simply of your own volition. So I'll give you the perfect example. You can make an amazing transatlantic career in the private sector. And even not just working in your sort of traditional sales or marketing job, right? So many different private sector companies or organizations need to understand the policy context transatlantically. We saw that, I think, most visibly 2 years ago when the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was being put forward, and then all of a sudden all of these companies were like, oh my gosh, what does this mean for me and my company, my operations? And there was a huge demand for policy experts who understood the European Union, that particular policy area, and so on. So I think there's definitely a lot of evidence out there that that you can do that. And I think if you look at alumni of various transatlantic programs, you can definitely see that. So I'm sure Katie will speak to the TAM program at UNC, but one I worked with a lot is the Fulbright Schumann program, which is a really interesting and unique experience, which allows Americans to study more than one European country, and it covers the entire gamut of transatlantic relations. And their alumni have gone on to do so many different things, and all have sort of transatlantic careers per se. So you can make it anything you want.
Yeah. No, that's a fair question. I think a lot of people think only in terms of think tanks, when there's a very dense network of interactions that happen across the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
And I'll mention my friend who joined Booz Allen some years ago in Washington, spent time on the side perfecting her French, and 2 years ago transferred over to their Paris office.
Mm-hmm.
She obviously went in with a very long-term vision of where she wanted to go, but those big consultancies with global offices do have opportunities if you're willing to put in the work and bring the skills to the table.
Absolutely. No, that's definitely the case. And people value that, also that sort of multicultural perspective that you can bring to any organization. So definitely possibility.
Yeah. So Katie, so looking across at all these different, there are a lot of different ways to approach it, but ultimately, no matter what area you're approaching, you're telling your story, you're presenting yourself. How do students and young professionals, how do you build your story to pursue that kind of career? What should you be doing as you build that story? And how do you tell it on the resumes, on LinkedIn, in the elevator?
Right. Yes, but I think that is really critical. The first thing I think is you have to throw out all the weirdness about talking about yourself, because I have seen so many students and alums, young professionals, leave off things from their resume, cover letters that are critical to their story, and they think it's not important. And it can be anything from waiting tables. Well, if you did that, you certainly learned communication and hard work. So those are important skills you may have learned. Or even a research project that you were working on with a faculty member, maybe an undergraduate or in your MA program, and it was about the transatlantic relationship, and you clearly learned skills there. People are selling themselves short every day, and don't do it. You have to stop now. You just have to find a way to put yourself out there. So please throw out the weirdness. Just sell your, you got to toot your horn and have somebody help you, because that also works sometimes a little better. And to also know that there's not one specific way to go about getting a transatlantic career or entering it or continuing in one. I think there's just, it's about you and your path and what you want and your interests, and figuring out the best way to tell that story on your resume, in your cover letter, on LinkedIn, but also when you get to the interview. And what I like to do with students is ask them, what are the 3 things that you really want someone to know about you? What are those things? And they can be very different across the board. Maybe it's your study abroad experience, maybe it's your research project, maybe it's the work you did, the volunteer job you had, all those things. And then make sure those examples, the skills you learned, the experience you had speaking with people from who knows where, the languages you've learned, and make sure that goes in there. So if you have 3 things that you want to tell when you get into an interview, when you get to that stage, make sure those 3 things come up. If they ask you a question about your experience, those 3 things, and you're well prepared to tell your story that way. Practice the elevator. If you have 30 seconds, what do you say in 30 seconds? And make sure that becomes, what do you want to say? And that will evolve, of course, when you've had experience and you've had a new project or you've got a new volunteer gig. And let that happen, and maybe some other things then start to move away off your resume. But make sure you're focusing on what's most important, what sets you apart, what do you feel like is where's the enthusiasm in what you've experienced, and how can you get that across?
No, it's a really good point. I also tend to think of it as bringing together 2 elements. You want to highlight your skills, like what can you do? Can you write? Can you organize? Are you an events person? Like highlight what value you're going to bring, but then also highlight nascent expertise.
Right.
In theory, all of you should be writing articles, whether it's for a blog or your student newspaper or whoever, that indicates that you actually have an interest in these areas, in these fields. And these serve not only as writing samples, but indicative that this is the area that you want to be working in.
Right.
I interviewed a young woman a few months ago, really bright, really sharp, and she really wanted to convince me that she was passionate about the field she was interviewing for. And I went through her LinkedIn profile and her background, and she had written a lot about a very different policy area, and didn't seem to have any, to me, it came off as this was sort of opportunistic. And maybe she will go into the field I was interviewing her for, but I didn't see any depth of background or interest. So keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind to show expertise, nascent expertise, and no one expects you to be an expert yet, but show that these are things you're thinking about, that your mind is wrapping itself around these issues. So we have these skills and these interests and these stories. Now we've got to take them out there. And one thing we hear all the time in Washington is to go out and network, which always sounds to be so mercenary and mercenary and a little bit boring. Tim, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think my thoughts on this have certainly evolved given the current context we're in, where networking at events, you know, and going to happy hours is no longer really a thing in the world we're currently living in. But that doesn't mean that you can't still do it. And I think this is actually where, and this connects very much to what you were just talking about, Jean, in the sense that if you are going to be writing and engaging on the substance, you also simultaneously have to engage with other people on it. Where are you going to put that? This is what social media was made for. Twitter is can be an amazing networking tool. I know a high school teacher out of Wisconsin who exclusively through the use of Twitter developed enough contacts in Brussels to organize a study tour for his students to Brussels, meeting people from all the various different institutions. And he met all of these people through Twitter by engaging with them on Twitter. All of you have an opinion about transatlantic relations. Well, you know, absolutely not just should you post about it on Twitter, but make sure that you're replying to other people with your opinion about a certain thing, making sure that you're tagging people in your posts so that you're actually getting on their radar. And I think you'll be surprised and shocked at actually at how many people, including some very well-known people, will be willing to engage with you directly. So I think that's exactly what Twitter was made for. LinkedIn as well was made for this. If you're writing something, it doesn't have to necessarily be published with an established organization. Obviously that's in the ideal world, but there's another platform out there, Medium, where you as an individual can put your own thoughts out there. And so then use Medium to host that content, but then you can share it through Twitter, through LinkedIn, and I think you'll find a lot of people, you know, interested in what you have to say. But it's about you starting that dialogue and kicking that off, and not being afraid to say, "Hey, you over there, like you should care about, you know, take a look at what I said. I'd be curious what you think."
Yeah, saying it nicely, of course. Hey,
course.
There, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, and I think that underlines sort of the real issue around networking. It's not some mercenary acquisition of business cards. It's about conversations. Because ultimately, you know, you're looking for a job now, but in the longer term, the people that you're networking with now are going to be colleagues, are going to be sources for articles, are going to be research partners, are going to be ultimately. And so approaching it in, you know, in the mindset of really getting to know people and being curious and, you know, and mutually looking for opportunities. You might get a listing for a job that you're not interested in, but maybe someone that you connected with would be, or would know people who would be, and you can pass that on. So thinking of it as something that you're both, you know, you will gain from it, both personally and professionally, I hope, but it's also, a network is something you have to feed as well.
It is, and there are some established networks already, you know, that you can join to start that process. So the German Marshall Fund has a Young Transatlantic Network. There's the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, which has many chapters around the world. In DC, there's the Washington European Society. Many, I mean, for those students who are on in this event, many of you are probably connected already with European Horizons, which is a student-run think tank, which has chapters all over the country. So there are some established networks already, but don't necessarily sort of keep yourself to those pre-established organizations.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on the next thing I'd like to talk about before we go to questions. And for all of you watching and listening, start thinking about your questions. That's really the main point of us being here. How do you go about looking for a job during a pandemic and a recession? I know, Kim, you sort of touched on this a little bit about networking through Twitter, but what are other strategies for going about this? What if, you know, it's both the finding a job when you might not be able to interview in person, but also maybe the job that you were looking for isn't there right now. And how do you approach that? Katie, do you want to jump in on that first?
Sure. Thanks for bringing this up. And I also can't stress enough the idea of writing. What Jean and Tim, you both said is absolutely spot on. Thank you for bringing that up. So yes, where we find ourselves, clearly a very strange situation. But, you know, it's not the end of the world. And I think this point about social media is critical. I think LinkedIn is really something you should invest a lot of time in. Your profile, make sure you have a background picture, make sure your picture does not have a glass in it, make sure it's professional.
Make sure it doesn't have a shoulder cut off on the side.
Have a good picture taken, yes. And then, and make sure, you know, and again, it's also sort of strange. Networking is strange. It's hard to build up enough confidence to go up there and just talk to someone. But when you can get on LinkedIn, people are expected to be, people are contacting each other online all the time now. It's the world we are in right now. So use LinkedIn to your advantage. Search the companies, the organizations, the places you're interested in. See if you might have an overlap there. Think about investing in LinkedIn Premium for a month for free. You know, connect with people, ask them questions, reach out. You know, can we do a virtual informational interview, or can I take you to a virtual coffee? You know, and find ways to connect with people, alumni from your same institution. Find ways to connect, and it's what people are expecting right now. And I think Jean is absolutely correct. Everyone's been in this boat. Everyone's been asking. People are looking for folks with enthusiasm who will come to you. It makes our lives as people who hire folks easier if you come to us and show us your strengths and your enthusiasm. And, you know, talk to friends and colleagues and who you have right now. You know, ask for endorsements and show your skills, your interests on your LinkedIn profile, I think. And plus, of course, there are job postings there. And, you know, I was hired for my job right now via Skype. It was before we all talked about Zoom. And it's a weird thing to be in a different time zone and to be interviewed by a whole bunch of people that you can't really see that are squeezed into the room. But it works. You know, you just have to make sure that you that your internet connection works and that you can present yourself in the same way in person as via Zoom. So I think that connecting with people, and I can't stress enough to keep track of all your contacts. Create a spreadsheet.
Yes.
Who have you had been in touch with in the past? Make a note what you talked about, whether you talked about, you both have golden retrievers. You know, I mean, people are people, right? They want to connect about things and your favorite gelato or whatever it might be, and make a note and reach back out to those people, because you never know who they know, who might be looking for someone to hire. Virtual internships are abound. You know, we have a campaign season. There's a lot still happening. I'm looking for interns. Life goes on, right? We still need help. So I think that we have to use this strangeness and use the technology to our advantage. And I think that's just don't be afraid to get out there.
Yeah.
If I may jump on top of after that, to pitch two different things. One is that the European Parliament actually, I think, is still offering internships, and you can still apply. The deadline, I think, is the 15th of this month, so you can still get on that. And then, of course, this moment is also a great time to consider graduate studies. You know, as Katie knows all too well, you know, I did grad school in Europe. That's something I wanted to do. It was, frankly, cheaper than doing grad school in the U.S. Obviously, sort of moving and travel to other places is rather difficult right now. But grad school is a perfectly legitimate and really quite useful option to consider right now. But I'm sure Katie has more to say about that than I do.
If I may, Jean, I just, I'd love to, I think Tim is absolutely right. There are, you know, if you're eager to, so now, most of you said that you'd like to be in the US, so the Transatlantic Master's Program, if I may mention it, and I'm happy to see TAM students out in the audience, is a great way. So it's a program that starts at UNC Chapel Hill and then takes you to one of our partners in Europe, and you can get a degree from both institutions. So that's one way, for example, to get to Europe, and we purposely keep it extremely affordable. So if you have questions about it, please let me know. There are also lots of MA programs in Europe. If you're eager to have some experience in Europe, there are so many great programs, and not just in European studies directly. There are several great ones, Maastricht, Bruges, a College of Europe. But there are also programs, if, you know, I have a student who graduated, got her teaching English as a foreign language certificate, lived in rural Hungary for a year teaching English, and is now doing an MA program in history in Berlin. So, you know, there are these different paths to get to where you want to go. And I think looking at graduate school is a really good option right now. I mean, make sure that, you know, financially it's all going to be okay. But think about potentially going to Europe and finding a way to get those skills, right?
Yeah.
There are sources of funding.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just add to that, going into graduate school, like, it's great. You're going to read a lot. You're going to learn a lot. But take advantage of the time that you have as a student to do other things, whether it's presenting a paper at a conference. Like, if you're a grad student, there are opportunities for that, and very few people, not enough people, take advantage of that. So be presenting those papers, volunteer with a local NGO, get that, you know, in some countries you might not be able to get a work permit, but you can probably volunteer and get that volunteer experience with a local trade association or human rights organization or whatever is going to flesh out your resume, and then suddenly you have that overseas work experience. So I think, you know, thinking strategically, like, it's not just, okay, I'm going to go to grad school because this is the parachute for the pandemic. Think through what else can you get out of it? What can you take advantage of as a student that isn't always accessible as a young professional?
Absolutely. And how it fits in your overall sort of what I consider sort of a career narrative. Sort of how would going to grad school fit in? And likewise in this moment, how does this moment, the pandemic, the situation that you're in, how you can tell future employers you dealt with this current situation is going to say a lot about you as an individual, as a potential employee, because this is for entrepreneurship. Like, this is making lemonade out of the really crappy lemons that we've all been through. So what can you do with this? What can you innovate out of this moment that may stand out 6 months, 2 years from now? You know, there is no single right answer or pathway for what to do in this moment. So you kind of dig deep and get a little creative.
Start digging a bit, and like, as a practical example for the interns in the audience, you're probably interning remotely. Your supervisor's probably super busy and torn in 6 different directions and not used to this remote management. Make sure that your supervisor takes time to sit down with you and make sure that you've identified a deliverable for the end of your internship. There's an article or a research paper or an online event. There's all sorts of things, but make sure that you're getting a deliverable out of this internship experience that you can show, that you can put in your resume, that you can talk about. You know, keeping in mind your supervisors are busy. I'm sure they love you, but sometimes they forget to care and feed. So remind them that you're there. Remind them to, you know, sit down and have that conversation if you haven't already. I would love to open it up to questions. I see we have a nice Zoom chat function here. Does everyone see that? Did that work? Oh, excellent. Okay, Christina. I worked in Brussels for 30 years running trade associations there. I'm intimidated. I recruited a lot. There is no shortage of highly qualified and multilingual candidates from across the EU. It is very competitive. Please also bear in mind that there are restrictions for US citizens to access internships, jobs in Brussels, and more generally. I do not expect this to be easier moving forward. This is very true. I did graduate school in London in another decade. And at the time, I could get a work permit. And so I ended up staying there for about 4 years. That changed, and I don't think graduate students or students in general get work permits after they do their time. However, being overseas, being in a graduate program, again, you can volunteer with an NGO, with a trade association, you can volunteer. And when you come back to Washington, that experience does matter. That experience, you know, I agree, it will be very difficult to get jobs overseas for a while, at least in Western Europe, but there are ways to leverage experience. Tim, Katie, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, so I think if you do end up choosing grad school, sometimes while the work permit situation has certainly changed, certainly in the UK and much of Europe, after grad school, you oftentimes are allowed to work during grad school on a part-time basis. So it's a very good time to find another internship. I was very lucky when I did my master's degree at King's College London. The British Council very kindly agreed to let me continue to work for them part-time, moving from Washington to London. So I was able to still kind of keep up my working skills, but also continue to engage with substance. So that was really important, and it's what I think allows also a lot of people financially to be able to to afford grad school and the living expenses as well. So keep in mind that a lot of places may be open to part-time arrangements for working while you do your degree.
And also, if you are obtaining your degree from the institution abroad, that also can make a difference. We've seen students, TAM students, stay in Berlin and have they have a certain amount of time after completing the degree to look for a job, to stay with their visa. In Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Spain, various countries, they all do it a little differently. So you clearly have to look into all of these in great detail. But if you are obtaining the degree from an institution in that country, that often allows you to stay a little bit longer and to keep looking. So look into that more specifically. There are options there.
Yeah. Elizabeth asks, first she says, this has been super helpful and interesting. So thank you, Tim and Katie. She's had Western Europe experience, UK, France, but most of the posts she sees are Central and Eastern Europe focused. So how can she look for more Western Europe focused careers and jobs? And if CEE is a growing sector, how can she develop skills experience in a region she doesn't know that much about? Who wants to jump in?
To learn more, so I would say to learn more about the region, I think engaging with local media is probably the best step. You will find a lot of good English language media. Obviously, language is a huge component of getting to know a certain region. So I would certainly encourage that. There are tons of free resources out there to learn new languages. In terms of Western Europe and Western European opportunities, I think the corporate sector might be an interesting place to look and not to forget about, because the corporate sector is still going to need people who are either well connected or very knowledgeable about the broader policy context. So I think don't discount that possibility.
I would also say, so yes, absolutely on the language front, I would do research. I think the point again about writing, if you're interested in learning more about those, that area of Europe, then do some research, do some writing, show your interest, start learning Serbo-Croatian or Czech, Polish, learn a language. I think language is so critical because even if you can't speak it fluently from obviously one day to the next, maybe you can. I don't want to assume your skills at learning, but even if you can have a conversation with someone on the side in some sort of network reception or during a dinner, you build a relationship there. Even if the business transactions or organizational transactions are happening in English, that part shows it shows enthusiasm and effort. So language learning is really critical to all of this. Also look at, if you're interested, if corporate sector is not your thing, exchange opportunities, universities, study abroad organizations, Forum on International Education. There are so many places that offer, like the TEFL certificate. One of their huge hubs is in Prague, and all these students come together and learn get their certificate there over the summer. So there are opportunities. I think just look. Oh, and then also, of course, look at embassies and consulates. If you live close, what kind of events are happening? What is the Hungarian embassy or the Polish embassy or the consulate doing close to you? Could you potentially get a virtual internship, or just get involved, meet people, engage with events that they're doing?
Yeah, I want to echo what Katie said just on the international education front, because it will, again, once this pandemic is over, it will be a huge industry. I think obviously it's taken a significant hit at the moment, but international education and exchanges, part of my personal hope and work that I hope to do in the future is to ensure that we can get back to the place where we were in terms of exchanges, both educational, professional, and otherwise, because I think they are hugely important. And it's a sizable industry unto itself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think realistically, what Christina was saying, Western Europe is going to be incredibly difficult to just pack a bag and go move there and find jobs. That's going to be the reality for a long time. And I think that's, that might be a separate discussion, whether or not you can relocate to other countries in a world that is shutting down a little bit. But I think, even if you're not able to go and live in London now, you can develop expertise around Brexit. You can look for jobs in trade. You can look, there's definitely ways to develop sort of that transatlantic career. It might not land you in the UK in the next 5 years, but it might in the next 10 years. And so
I think it's safe to say at least that Brexit will be a growth industry for the foreseeable future, regardless of the state of the pandemic. So certainly there will be a lot of jobs available if you have any deep knowledge of Brexit and the implications.
Yeah. It might land you in Washington, and that might be your permanent base, but I think it would still be interesting work. And Transatlantic.
Yes.
We have a question from Grace. She's an undergraduate in the US studying German and government. What is your advice for marketing language skills simply beyond listing it on my resume? Katie, do you want to grab that?
Sure. Make sure that I think instead of not just, obviously you'll have a section, right? German skills, whatever they might be. But also weave it into other places. Where have you spoken it? Were you in the German club? Do you like German film? Are you interested in specific things about Germany? Just because you've learned German, that doesn't necessarily equate to what interests you about Germany and what kind of path you'd like to go. Now, of course, the combination of German and government, that leads one to believe that you like politics. So what is it about it that interests you most? Put it in, in context in other places in your resume, maybe the research papers you've written, the time you spent abroad or not, but where have you spoken it, where have you practiced it, where are the touch points throughout your life and experience that really hone that part in. And German is not easy, so it's good to show that you have that experience.
Yeah. And I would say, especially if you have written anything.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Whether
or
academic,
anything.
Yeah, academic or non-academic. Like if you have a Twitter account, engage with people with German, with Germans in German about German politics, government, etc., and that will sort of take you one step ahead of where a lot of people in the transatlantic space may be. I know there's a bunch of people out there who will see that, ooh, Angela Merkel has said something really interesting, but shoot, there are no captions there's no subtitles on the video, and you can actually say, be one step ahead and actually sort of provide early analysis, whether in English or German, about what's happening. So it really is an added value.
Frederica is asking, I'm a young professional from Italy with specialized training in European and transatlantic security and defense, 2 master's degrees. And has completed 2 traineeships with the European Parliament and the EU ISS. I'd like to get some experience in the US now, but whenever I apply for jobs there, I get told that the institution or think tank in question does not sponsor visas. What can I do? Tim,
yeah, sure. So yes, that is quite typical. A lot of think tanks do not have the ability or the capability to sponsor visas. I would recommend looking at 2 other types of institutions. One is universities, not just necessarily to study, but to potentially be a fellow, to continue to do research, and that's something that universities do have the ability to do. The second thing is, frankly, sort of defense companies and aerospace companies. They need to know what the policy areas are. There are lots of those here in the US, both American companies and European companies. There's BAE Systems, Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed. You may need to sort of navigate that a little bit carefully, because some of them may require security clearances. So just be aware when you're looking at companies what that situation might be. But yeah, those are, I think, still 2 possibilities in the security and defense field. Likewise, if you look at, it's not in DC, but NATO also has a significant installation. NATO ACT is the acronym, but Allied Command for Transformation, I believe it stands for, but which is based out of Norfolk, Virginia. So, which is also, I mean, it's still technically transatlantic experience here, even if it's not in Washington.
I would say too, corporate is, you know, look for, just as Jean was giving the example of a corporate job on this side of the Atlantic that then can send people abroad. Think about it, you know, where you are, what would interest you, where could you maybe find a job in Europe that could then potentially take you to the US. I've seen that happen lots of times, and we have, there's a lot of European investment in North Carolina, and we have an incoming TAM student who's been working for a German company here in the Research Triangle Park for a couple of years, and then decided to stay to do our program. So I think that's another way.
Yeah, and a lot of those same consulting firms like Booz Allen Hamilton, right, they get a lot of defense contracts from the US. They often tend to have the most opportunities for mobility in that way, so that's also worth looking into.
Yeah, and there are fellowship programs as well, not necessarily tied to universities. I think Atlantic Council has a Global Young Leaders program. It has a different name, but Atlantic Council has an interesting program. You know, that has an international cohort, but they convene in Washington a few times a year. It doesn't necessarily get you to Washington for a period of time, but it does sort of pave the way for maybe eventually going into a longer term fellowship program. There's a lull in the questions, but I would like to ask you, what would you say, each of you, the #1 skill that students, young professionals can develop right now that will serve them well in the years to come?
You first.
What's that? Okay, Katie, you're on the spot.
Okay, this is one thing is really hard to say, but I would, I think I'm going to combine two things to make them one. Is that cheating a little? I would say,
No, go for it.
I would say language and writing. I think those are really good ways to get yourself out there, that if you can prove your language skills and your writing ability, and you can do that both in English or in your other language. And it's a way, as we've been saying, you know, a way to put your opinions, your thoughts, your research. So I think that, and, you know, Duolingo, you can certainly have a tandem partner via Zoom. There are lots of ways to keep that going. Those would be kind of my, right now. I mean, there's a million other things to be doing, but I was asked to say one.
I would probably second the writing component, which is to say that there are so many different types of writing to do that you can do. It's important to demonstrate competence in all sorts of different kinds. So in my career, I have had to do academic writing. I've also had to do briefings, say for a senior, for the EU ambassador when I was at the delegation, or other senior people, which is a very different type of writing. I've had to write, project proposals. I've had to write social media. I've had, blog posts, etc. So there's a lot of different writing styles, and if you can demonstrate very easy facility and transitions between those different styles of writing, I think that will be very important. I think especially if you are coming out of an academic institution, have either zero or very limited sort of professional writing context, like write a draft policy brief, write 2 pages tops. If I'm writing a policy brief for an ambassador or a senior manager as they're about to go into a meeting, or talking points, write a speech, writing comes in all different shapes and sizes in a professional context, and you can demonstrate added value no matter what job you're applying for or can move into if you demonstrate really sharp writing skills. And workshop it, right? Yeah. So like if you have other friends who are in the same boat as you, both of you write a policy brief or a senior briefing and then workshop them. So
over whiskey, preferably.
Yes.
If you're over 21, only for over 21.
Yes.
Yeah. No. I think that both of you, like, that's an incredibly important point. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten memos from people who should be better writers, and they put the ask at the bottom of the page. They put the bad news in the middle of the text. Like it's just amazing how so many people don't treat clear communication as a priority. And if you do treat it as a priority, that is something senior management notices immediately. And if you're able to do that, then people will just automatically funnel other opportunities your way, because they know you can, if you can communicate clearly, and and ultimately that says you can think clearly. That may not always be accurate, but that's an assumption.
And what I would also say is to do it in a timely manner.
Yes.
When people write in job descriptions a fast-paced environment, they're not kidding. They're talking. What you're talking about is potentially, oh my gosh, Tim, I didn't realize that the ambassador needed a briefing on this. Can you do
10 minutes?
In 15 minutes? Go.
Yeah.
Like that
Very
type
true.
of. So when you're also workshopping with your policy brief or you're briefing with your friend, give yourself a time limit.
Yeah.
Is the type of increasingly I'm seeing employers offer writing tests or sort of pressure challenges to just see how well you cope under pressure, and that's the type of stuff you can test yourself.
Yeah. No, and that's something you could pull together a Zoom group and workshop, BYOB. So we have a question. Let's see, my scroll button. Stuart is currently in a COVID paused MA program in Paris and interning for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Currently debating if I should switch into a different MA program with classes in French at the Sorbonne. Do you think this is worth it? So he's at the American University of Paris. Should I switch to the Sorbonne? Do you think it's worth it? There are obviously added costs, time. I'm wondering if the job experience is more important. Your thoughts? Katie, do you want to go first?
Sure. That is really hard to answer without being able to ask you 15 more questions at least. I think it's really about what you want. Ultimately, what do you think, if your COVID pause program is going to be going back, in the fall, if it's going offline completely, that's a different matter. But I think if you could contact me separately, we could talk through it. But I think you need to figure out what's most important to you. Getting the, look at the coursework, the experience you would get, the faculty you could work with. Are you getting really good individualized attention at the moment? Do you need more of that? There are lots of different things to think about when you would switch something like that. And it's not a decision to take lightly.
Yeah, and I would also say that if language is the chief concern,
Right.
the chief question, like there are many other ways to acquire that deep language ability without necessarily having to do all of your coursework in French. So by sheer fact of living in Paris, making sure that if you are engaging with other people that you're doing it in French, that you find opportunities to write in French. There are ways to do that without necessarily putting yourself through the challenge. And certainly if I were in your position, it would be hugely challenging for me to do master's level coursework in French. So that's a significant step. But Katie's absolutely right, which is to say, to go back to an earlier comment I made, how would that change fit in the overall narrative of your academic and professional career? So if you were able to come up with a very coherent reason why you would make that change, and to explain how that program at the Sorbonne is going to get you to the next thing that you want to do, then that developing those coherent narratives for your different options, I think, is going to really help you in figuring out what decision you're going to take and what you really want out of the experience.
Yeah, those are both good points. So I'm going to throw one last question out there, and then we should wrap up. And while you two are talking about this question, I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and I just want to share a couple resources that I think are useful. There's an ocean of resources, so that by no means exhaustive, but there are a few things that could be useful. So the question, which will be our last one, Grace is currently in the process of applying to law school. Do any of you have knowledge or advice on pursuing a transatlantic legal career? Go.
Yes, I do. There are lots of LLM programs in Europe, which, while they will not formally contribute to you getting a sort of a law degree in the U.S. or help you get admitted to the bar, they are, I think quite useful. So I had a friend who was studying, who I lived with in London, who had already gone to law school in the U.S. but wanted to study European environmental law because there were a number of different companies or organizations that you wanted to join or work for in the future where knowledge of European law was going to be quite useful and that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get from a US course. So I do think there can be value in looking for LLM programs in Europe, but be very deliberate about and very sort of conscious about which programs you'd be looking at. And again, going back to that coherence narrative, where does that fit in to what you ultimately want to do? But those programs do exist. They're usually 1 year and can be quite useful. If you want to sort of even shorten it even more, the coursework itself that you'd be required to do in Europe would probably only be 8 or 9 months, and then you could come back to the US and write your thesis and submit it remotely. So those are certainly possibilities.
Thank you, Tim. So I've shared a couple resources. Hopefully you can see it. If not, I'll send it to Scott to circulate. So these two folks, Christy and Nick, are always sharing very practical advice for careers, for applying for jobs, and they're both, they bounce between the US and Europe, so they're also very aware of how to make these transitions. Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, really fantastic organization, a lot of opportunities to write. On Think Tanks is a great organization that has a great job board for a lot of think tank jobs. This reflects my own career preferences. And then John Quincy Adams Society, they bring a certain perspective to foreign policy, but they have an amazing job board. So definitely worth checking out. And Scott can circulate that if he thinks it's useful. Tim, Katie, thank you so much. I feel like I learned something. It's great talking with both of you. Scott, thank you so much for hosting. And Scott, I want to turn it back over to you. And thank you, USEA, for hosting this event.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Katie. Amazing conversation, incredibly practical. I loved your comments about grad school, social media, about staying, positive and enthusiastic about the transatlantic relationship. So amazing conversation. I just want to say to everyone before they sign off that we'll do our next virtual event later this month. And so please check your emails and we'll make sure everyone on this list is invited to the next event. And with that, thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Scott and Jean. Thank you,
Yes,
everyone.
thank you very much. Cheers.
So great to see some familiar faces and names out there. Good luck,
Absolutely.
everybody.